son, Mama Dee here. Happy Father's Day to you. You never know what little Ron herds or RTC2s are running around, and they just didn't tell you.
And welcome back, family, to another wonderful edutainment edition of the Artivist Presents We All Be Radio. I'm your host for the empowerment segment, Brother Ron, also known as R2, C2, H2, the Artivist. And this is another wonderful day, a beautiful Sunday, no matter where you are, as long as you are above ground, breathing, enjoying this moment in time. And please feel free, family, to join us today. It'll be a great topic discussion. Got a wonderful, esteemed, powerful guest on the phone with us today in this conversation. Please feel free to join us. Call in area code 646-652-4593. Once again, that's area code 646-652-4593. And if you're scared to go on the air, we got the chat room, which is about to be opened up in a couple of moments. Feel free to type in your questions, your comments, your concerns, and who knows, some of your questions, comments, and concerns may be read to our guest so he can respond to them as well. And like the first, before we get too involved, I'd like to also add that I want to send out my condolences to the good folks in the D.C., the DMV area. We had lost one of our great icons. Brother Marion Barry passed away earlier today at the hospital. He was 78 years old, but this man is arguably probably the greatest mayor that Black America has ever seen and produced. What I love about Marion Barry, I'm from Memphis, Tennessee right now. I'm broadcasting from Memphis. Marion Barry had roots in Memphis, Tennessee. He went to Booker T. Washington High School in South Memphis back in the 50s. And also he's a proud graduate of Lemoyne Owen College, which is a historically Black college that is near Booker T. Washington High School. So this guy, he's one of the founding members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I mean, he's got the pedigree and the resume. People should research more about Marion Barry. And I also want to tell people, as you know, in this day and age, what Brother Malcolm said, which we'll be talking about shortly, that the media is the most powerful entity on the planet because it can tell you who your friends are. Or better yet, it can make your enemy your friends and your friends your enemy, and also to make the innocent look guilty and the guilty look innocent. So that's how powerful the media is in this day and age. So before we start, calling Marion Barry, he was a crackhead, the bitch set him up and all that stuff, look at his history. We got YouTube, we got the internet, the real fourth or fifth estate, whatever you want to call it. Please do your own research. Think for yourself. When you do for self, you think for self, and then you free yourself. So I'm just giving condolences to Brother Marion Barry and his family and to the greater family, because every time I meet a person from D.C., which is interesting, they really have this loyalty to Marion Barry. In spite of his flaws, he was a 4-term mayor. He was elected by the people 4 terms. The first term he was elected as mayor, white folks put him in office. And then all the second and third and fourth terms, strong Black urban support in D.C., and we should look at that, how he did his politics. He really was a true power broker, a true power player. I mean, he gave everybody in D.C. a job who wanted one. He made sure that Black business people got wealthy and rich by getting some of the contracts for the city in the construction business. So look at the blueprint that Brother Marion Barry laid out, for he is the standard that we should measure our public service in terms of his performance in office. Now, they did the same thing to Marion Barry they did to Adam Clayton Powell Jr. in that his last mayoral term, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was the greatest politician we ever seen that Black America ever produced, according to Dr. John Henry Clark. And I'll have to agree with him that Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was a phenomenon that needs to really be studied in a sense, because he got the job done for Black America, and by him getting the job done for Black America, it empowered the rest of America. So please do your research on Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Don't believe what the white stream media has to say about him as well. There's truth in a lie, but do your own research. Like I said, if you think for self, you do for self, you free yourself. So please feel free to do the homework. But Adam Clayton Powell Jr. in his last term, they took away his seniority, his power, even though he was elected by the people of New York to serve them. But they took away his powers, just like they did with Marion Barry. In his last 4th term as mayor, they took away his power Then they gave his power back to his the person who succeeded him, who was Anthony Williams. Now, Anthony Williams, he worked for the city. They used Anthony Williams to deny Mayor Berry his power as mayor, but once they got Marion Berry out of power, they gave all the power back to Anthony Williams. And you look at what happened to Adam Clayton Powell Jr., they took away his power, although he won a powerful decision in the Supreme Court as it relates to his last term. They took away his seniority and gave it to Charles Rangel. So you see how this stuff plays out? You know, history always repeating itself. So anyway, let me get to our guest. He's a wonderful, brilliant historian, genealogist. He is the founder and the executive director of the Sankofa Restoration Project. And he's a beautiful brother. He comes from a strong pedigree himself. His father was the Honorable Samuel B. Wright, a very powerful political figure in New York State history. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Without further ado, I bring to you, boys and girls, scholars and laymen, the one and only, the truly profound Brother Herbert Wright. Welcome to We All Be, sir.
It's Howard Wright and
I'm sorry, Howard Wright. Sorry. Sorry,
I'm not too kind, brother.
Well, you're a good brother, man. I had some talks with you offline, and I wish people could have just listened to the stuff we were talking about offline, because it's basically, you make it plain, bro. Like Brother Malcolm used to say, make it plain. You made it plain how this system really works and conspire against black people, and also as well as our contributions within the same system. So I was talking about, you know, the stuff you're doing with the Sankofa Restoration Project.
Okay. Let me start with telling you how we started the Sankofa Restoration Project. Its purpose and what we have accomplished and what we're about to accomplish after the works that we have been involved. About 35 years ago, I began a quest to take a look at the histories of black people in the United States. Started with my family. And primarily, even though I graduated high school in a southern town, Beaufort, South Carolina, Robert Smalls High School, and was familiar with the area and where my family came from there. I wasn't aware that I had another part of my family in Hilton Head, South Carolina, in which we had a cemetery. And being born in Brooklyn, New York, and growing up in the city of New York, families don't have their own cemeteries. You don't know what a family cemetery looks like, mostly from a northern perspective. So when I got there and I found out we had one, I made inquiries about it and found out that the history of my family ran steep. You know, we had over 50 people that fought in the Civil War that buried in various cemeteries on Hilton Head in the general area. And primarily there was a long history of folks that could be traced back to these cemeteries. So I began to look at the cemetery and say, gee, I think I want to know a little bit more about my family. But when I looked at the cemeteries, we found out that I couldn't do my family without studying the rest of the cemeteries in here. And as I studied the rest of the families, I found that most of the families had strong traditions. And so primarily one thing led to the other, and I found myself cataloging all the cemeteries in South Carolina to be able to further the research. But we were doing this mostly from New York, so it was, you know, me getting down to South Carolina every once in a while, so it was a more of a part-time thing. So when I got involved in a movement in New York City, it's called the African Burial Ground. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you know anything about the African Burial Ground, but the African Burial Ground in New York City, which is one of the largest cemeteries ever on Earth in the Northern Hemisphere that contains pre-colonial remains of black people, happens to be the largest one ever on Earth in the history of the United States. Whereas over 20,000 people were initially buried there. A lot of the inhabitants were the ones that, the families that built Wall Street. Now, I know a lot of people hear about Wall Street from afar, but technically speaking, Wall Street was, the wall that was built on Wall Street was to keep the Native Americans out of the other side, because most of New York City was lower Manhattan, or New York was lower Manhattan. And they didn't want the Native Americans attacking them, so there had to be a wall. Well, the Africans built the wall on Wall, and to keep them out. And then later on, after they got...
Oh, Brother Howard, let me interrupt you, kind of going in and out. Brother Howard.
Oh, sorry. And later on, when they got manumitted, a lot of them, by the Dutch, they were then themselves put over the wall, in which it was mostly swamp area, an area that was really not farmable. But the Africans made a way out of nothing and built the farmland that later expanded that part of New York. But in the meantime, from the lower Manhattan to the Chinatown, which was going about, I imagine, about 10, 15 blocks going north from lower Manhattan, was what we call Lower Africa. And that's where City Hall is right now, and some of the other places. As a result of the Africans being there, they buried a lot of people there. And there was this whole burial ground there that literally was eventually paved over by dirt, because New York City was built on hills, and to level the ground, they had to fill it with dirt in order to level it, and then there were buildings on top of buildings put on it over the dirt, and then finally the burial ground was so far down that everybody forgot it was there. It wasn't until the federal government decided to build a brand new building, the Jacob Javits building, for one of the New York State senators that had died, as a monument to him. Did they go deep enough down that they discovered that there were remains? Now, they had already known that there's a possibility that there was a cemetery there, but nobody ever thought it was still in existence. And all the dirt that was put on top of each other preserved that cemetery in a way that nobody really could imagine that it could be preserved. So what happened was that the federal government continued to dig, and they desecrated some of the bones, and they were going to keep on going. And to the archaeologists for the city of New York, who noticed that they were digging up bones, reported it to the New York Times and said, well, you know, there's an African burial ground there. And of course, nobody ever associates New York State with slavery. And at least on a major level, that it had been involved in it. And so most of the residents in the city and the state of New York that were black were caught off by surprise. So when we found out that this had existed, we came down to try to find out what was going on. So we met with the federal government, and they gave us a song and a dance about how they are trying to preserve the bones and look at it, and they're going to take the bones out the ground and place it in a place where we can decide later on where they're going to be buried. And you know, our major concern for them were, hey, wait a minute, this is a major find. You're taking bones of our ancestors out the ground, and you're not even consulting with us what's going on. So we demanded that they stop the digging. And we found out later on that under the National Historic Preservation Act, the federal government initially were supposed to literally, by law, stop. Anytime you find something of a historic nature and it involves anything with federal or state funds, there's a procedure that you have to follow that mandates you preserve that site so that it doesn't disappear from the historical tapestry. So we went into a protracted struggle with them. In the meantime, I was still dealing with my family histories with the cemeteries down there. Here we had a major cemetery, and I started doing research. And so I couldn't really understand all the records that were going on. So most of it was written in the early Dutch. So what I did was I taught myself Dutch so that I can translate the records. And when I did that, it really gave me a larger view of what the history was. And I started doing much more research and became one of the activists for preserving that site and to stop the federal government. And so I'm going to fast forward a little bit so that you can know what happens. Eventually, the federal government lost the battle with us when the federal congressional hearing came. And told them that they violate the law and they have to respect the rights of the citizens of the city of New York. That was Brother Gus Savage from Chicago who headed that particular subcommittee. And it was one of the ones that I was very proud of because for community, there were only 4 people who represented the community's point of view as to the preservation of that cemetery. And we were invited by Congress to speak. One was Noel Pointer, who was a jazz musician. The other one was Brother John Henry Clark, who was a huge historian at the time. Another brother by the name of Olumbe Graff, who headed the Patrice Lumumba Coalition. And then finally it was me, who was running the only black newspaper at the time that covered exclusively the African burial ground called Ground Truth. As a matter of fact, we still publish Ground Truth, and this was in 1989, 90 to 91. We printed the first Ground Truth in 92, and I believe I even sent you a couple of copies of some of the later ones we had. So what happened was that after the Congress heard everything, they appointed a board that I was one of the people who were appointed of the 26 people to help sort of shepherd the direction of that burial ground. Now it's a national landmark, and it's a national historic. It's part of the national landmark, and it's on the National Registry. And there's people come from all over the world to see it. But in the meantime, while we were having the struggles, one of the things that happened was I was chairman of the Rules Committee and chairman of the Art and Architecture Committee, which literally approved all of the monuments that went into that building. And I had sort of a mini struggle with the board itself. I wanted them to pass a law that our committee had written, and it would have been the first law that would have given rights to African nations to either claim the remains or claim reparations for the remains that were harmed once they were identified which tribes they came. There was also a part of the law that we put together, which was supposed to be a permanent part, in which any time these cemeteries, any place around the country, were discovered or endangered by these people that are doing construction, that automatically a panel was put in place made up of people like ourselves who have been through the process long, that could advise the local people on how to proceed and preserve the cemetery. Well, the board at that time felt that that was too ambitious a plan, that they just wanted to deal with the burial ground. And there was just one other component to the law, and that was that as part of the reparations for the destruction of some of the remains that the government initially did, that there would be money set aside to give people of African descent scholarships and ways to be able to develop skills like becoming archaeologists, paleontologists, writers, historians, so that we can preserve and tell our own story in that way. So it was rejected, and I was kind of taken out at that particular point because they wouldn't even offer the hearings that we asked for. However, the great thing about it was that I'm a graphic artist, and I also am a historian, and I've done a lot of things on my own in terms of archiving things and doing preservation of historical. And what popped up in my mind at the time is I said, well, you know, the long and short of it is, do we really need federal monies to be able to do these things that we're asking? We've got the skills, we've got the wherewithal, we've got the will to want to do it, and so we created the Sankofa Restoration Project as a result of that. And we began to start looking at all the things that would be necessary to try to preserve our own history. Now, what happened in the meantime is that I was had a job as a graphic artist, and I was married at the time. And what had happened was that two things happened at the same time. I was in the middle of a separation from my wife, or beginning a process of a separation. And secondly, my job changed titles and asked me if I wanted to get a severance from it. So, and I thought about it, and they said, did I want to stay and go in their direction, or would I take the severance? And considering my situation, I decided to take the severance and move on down to South Carolina, where I could do most of my research. And so I went to South Carolina and we began the research. There was also one other thing that was going on in New York City, which we were having a debate on, and that was the national issue of reparations. And primarily, there was one group that said, well, let's go to court right now and file for reparations because we have, because the injury that had been done to people of African descent, and that just like Jews and other people, that we need to get something back for what it is. And I was wholeheartedly for the reparations. However, I took a different take. I told them, knowing a little bit about the law, I told them that, when you get to the courts, the judge is going to ask you a couple of questions. They're going to ask you, first of all, does he have jurisdiction to hear that particular matter? And if that's resolved, he's going to then ask you to define who the aggrieved parties exactly. What are their names? These people who are doing the class action suit, are they part of the people that were injured from the slave trade? Are these the people exactly? Who are their families? A lot of things that were going to be asked. And I said, before we get into court, don't you think we should do the research to answer those questions? And a lot of people say, well, we really can't. It takes too long. It's not feasible and that kind of stuff. And I differed with them. I said, I think that we're going to get knocked out if you don't do that. So I decided at the same time all this was going on when I went down that would be one of the missions of the Sankofa Project. And so, all that being said, we began to explore all of the different things that the Sankofa Project had initially done, which was the looking at cemeteries. And in addition to that, we start recording the histories of the families. We start looking at different avenues to be able to look at the documents. And you know, one of the most difficult things in African American genealogy is getting past the records for 1860. 1860, right around the time the Civil War started. Prior to that, most black people didn't have last names. They only had first names. So you have hundreds of thousands, millions of people with first names all over the place and documents for them, and how do you put them together? How do you match them? How do you even identify who is who together? You got 100,000 Johns, 100,000 Bills, and so forth. How are you going to do it? And we took almost 10 years debating that question and seeing what we have to do. But in the meantime, what had happened is we developed a very intricate system of identification, and we began to understand through our studies in cemeteries as a record source, and also the other sources that were available to us, making us think out the box, and doing a different type of analysis. And we began to develop a very unique way to looking at the genealogical history of our people, especially prior to 1860. And what we discovered was that there were that black people probably had more physical records that can identify their actions more than anybody else in the United States, and that when properly deciphered, you can actually trace every single one of the families using the methods that we developed all the way up to back to the slave ships again. And we began to apply most of this stuff that we had learned, and we found out one after one that it was feasible. Now this did two things. One, it solved it answered the question of whether it could be done. It could be done. And secondly, it also helped to bring the information that we first talked about with reparations. Can you identify who is who and what records are what, and what you need to do to file in court for reparations? I can tell you, Ron, today we can do that. And we're very proud of the work that we've done. As a matter of fact, we should be publishing some of our first results by either at least by the beginning of next year. And when we finish, we anticipate having over 54 volumes of information, specific and very detailed information on the history of the black family in South Carolina alone. And with the results, all one is going to have to do is know who their grandfather is in South Carolina, and you're going to be able to trace your family all the way back, hopefully, to a slave ship. And then there's another process after that, but we want to, keep to that particular part. And then we're looking to go after Georgia, after that, then Virginia, then back to New York, and then we're going to swing to Maryland and some of the other states. But primarily, and we're not even sure that I can complete this job before I make my transition out of here. So we're going to be training an awful lot of people to understand this process and to go forward. once this is finished, this will be effectively become the largest genealogical project ever unearthed in the United States history, black or white. And I know that's a long way of going about telling you how we started the project, but I thought some background was needed to talk about why our interest in doing this was there. So anyway, that's it.
Well, I appreciate all that. No, I mean, I think this is very important because, like, you talk about the naysayers, they talk about it will take too long to make the case for reparations by doing the research, but yet black folks have been in bondage and been terrorized by this system of white supremacy for the last several centuries. So what is 10 or 20 more years just to get it right? And also I'd like to add, too, with South Carolina, the reason why South Carolina is so important to the African-American narrative is the fact that the majority of the slaves, from my understanding, came through the Carolinas, through South Carolina. They landed there into the New World. And also you look at the history of South Carolina, where you got the Denmark-Vesey uprisings or potential uprising of 1823. I had the chance when I was down in Charleston just several weeks ago to visit the Hanging Tree spot. There's a spot in Charleston on a one-way street where they got this big tree in the middle of the one-way, splitting the one-way street, And legend has it that that's the spot where they hang Denmark Vesey and 34 of his co-conspirators in the supposed insurrection, the slave insurrection of Charleston. And, I think the original tree died, or they had to cut it down for, safety reasons, but they planted another tree there in its place. And this is very ominous because you think about the gentrification that's around Charleston. Charleston is a beautiful place, got a lot of history, but there's a lot of gentrification going on. But it's funny that the city fathers felt the need to keep that spot sacred. And you look at the Jewish people in Charleston. Now, the Jewish people down there, you look at their history, a lot of Jews owned slaves in Charleston. Some of the worst slave owners in Charleston were Jews. This guy named, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about it, and when we talk about the Jews in themselves, there are three classifications of Jews that we're looking at, and one is primarily the Sephardic Jews, and these are the ones that come from Spain. These are the upper elite type. These are the people who migrated to the Americas and became very wealthy, have family names. They never really considered themselves exclusively Jews, even though they were Jews in name, and they integrate themselves, particularly in the South. And I'm going to come back to them in a second. You have the Ashkenazi Jews, which were mostly German type Jews that were part of that heritage, who the Sephardics look down on disfavorably. They have never been America's been the only place in which the Jews have come together almost as a favorable place. Now, the other part of the Jews, the Eastern European Jews, that mostly were the ones that set up the Zionist movement that caused the rise of the State of Israel. And all three of them despised that particular group. Now, they came in at a different part, maybe the 1840s and around that time. But anyway, the Sephardic Jews were here from the early parts on, 1611, and they came on. And that's what's so important about that is they integrate themselves within the American system to the point that we became the buffers. We became the, for them, a lot of times where they went in the world, a lot of people would look and try to look at them as the bottom of the barrel. And we were the buffers for them because we became the bottom of the barrel, and they said for a change, there's somebody below us, and they joined the bandwagon with the rest of the whites to help to build the slave system. Some of the most wealthiest people in America at that time that owned that owned blacks were Jews. The head of the the Confederacy when they broke up. There was one Jew that held 4 different posts within the Confederacy, and the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the Attorney General, and one other post, and which they felt a close kinship to them. When you're talking about the Jews, most of the Jews were the biggest advocates of the fact that there needs to be a slave system, and that we need to be at the very bottom of the ladder. So it's not unusual to know that there were a heavy Jewish presence. You look in Charleston, look at some of those powerful cemeteries. It's a Jewish cemetery. You know, if you go all throughout the South, you'll see a Jewish presence, and in terms of cemeteries, in and out, and also some of these large houses that were built by blacks for some of these. So, and talking about the Jews themselves, they're as culpable in the slave trade as anybody else. As a matter of fact, they were some of the biggest advocates, some of the biggest people that were in the debate that helped to frame the issue of why we should be kept in perpetual servitude. So I thought I'd just mention that.
No, it's important. I mean, it's important because Charleston had a large population of Sephardic Jews. Charleston had a large population of Sephardic Jews. You think about Mordecai Cohen. Well, you know, he's a wealthy slave owner, but he treated slaves horrible, very horribly. When they run away, he would just whip them almost to death. And they had places where they would just torture the slaves in Charleston. And I thought it was interesting. Some of the Jewish people down there are very honest about their history. So it's very important to talk about this. Like I'm glad you broke it all down to different types of Jews and whatnot, because this is very important for people to know. Because even if you look at Alabama, Alabama, you had a lot of Jewish people settled in Alabama that exploited black communities. You had Jewish people go down there, start banks for black folks, and then all of a sudden when the black folks go to make a deposit or to withdraw, the bank no longer existed. You know, a lot of Jews owned land in Alabama, whereas black folks could not own property without any type of consequences or repercussions.
Well, you know, the main thing that people are to keep in mind is that for the Jews themselves, they have to have a buffer between, because if there wasn't black people, then they're next. They're the next people at the bottom of the totem pole, in which people would take a look at it and say, well, look, there are no more black people here, so who do we persecute? And as long as there were black people in this country, as long as we were at the bottom of the ladder, we were almost a safe buffer for them. And so it was in their best interest to make sure that the slave trade was maintained and done with themselves. Dr. Leonard Jeffries does a very, and you should have him on your program one time. He does a couple of things with the Rhode Island Sephardic community and their involvement in the slave trade, as well as them becoming the middlemen. In a large sense, particularly during the heavy Christian period, during the Renaissance, the Reformation, and in and around that particular time, the rise of the slave trade right after 1492, around the time that the Reformation and the Renaissance were created. And I just want to make a mention about that for a second, but I don't want to go off track with and dealing with that. That a lot of the Jews were involved. when the Jews came from Spain after the Inquisition, there were a group of Jews called the Morenos, and this particular group were the ones that told the people in the Sephardic area, which is another name for Spain, Portugal, that they were actually converting to Christianity because there was an Inquisition going on at the time. Right after the Moors were thrown out of Spain, and Ferdinand consolidated his power between Castile and Granada, and what happened was that they wanted to find a new Israel, and they wanted to find it any place in the world. They were the ones that helped to underwrite. A lot of people think that Isabel and Ferdinand underwrote the voyage for Columbus to come this way. But in actuality, these Sephardic Jews helped to fund a lot of that in hopes that a lot of that they could find a new place in Israel, a new Israel, and that's what they were looking for to build. And if you ever notice in Portugal and some of these other places, not Portugal, I mean Brazil, and some of these other places where there was a huge presence coming in as a result of the, for lack of a better word, I'm going to use discovery in quotes for Columbus. Right. You'll see that there were a huge contingent of Jews that came to this side of the world that populated the West Indies, that populated South America, that populated, and all this was an effort to try to build a movement towards trying to find a new Israel. And in actuality, we don't have time, but in talk about the history of the Zionist movement, which came later on in the 1890s going into the turn of the 20th century, there was a whole history of this type of activity going all the way from back then to look at that and find a new Israel until they finally maneuvered themselves into Palestine, which is a whole other story we're not going to go into. But, I mean, that's a very fascinating area in which we need to look at. But coming back to the Jews in America, their power in America through becoming traders and the like, and what I was saying about Rhode Island was that they became the middlemen because some of the Christians didn't want to deal with usury. And usury is the interest that comes off the money that one has, you give a loan, you give the interest. It's called usury. Well, a lot of European powers used the Jews as middlemen because they became bankers. And they became folks that would be able to transfer that usury to whatever governments or whatever other agencies that they were representing at that particular time. So they became a good middleman for that. And there was a huge controversy about that 20 years ago. When the curriculum of inclusion was debated in this country and in terms of dealing with trying to bring in the African history and the African American history that would be contemporaneous with the other histories in a way that it would be integrated and the like. The main people that rose up against that were the Jews. The main people that attacked the people who were trying to push the Adelaide, Dr. Adelaide Sanford, Dr. Jeffries, and the like, were mainly because what a lot of people would think is that, people just say that you're putting in feel-good history into the thing. And it wasn't all about that. It was about economics. Who are the biggest profiters or people who profit the most on history books and the publishing of these things in the education system in America. So the Jews. They have, particularly in New York City, where this controversy was coming up. You were talking about changing the curriculum for the public schools, the high schools, the colleges, and it would mean new books in different areas published by different people. Since the Jews had most of their hands on most of the finances and most of the wherewithal that dealt with the education in the state of New York, this meant that the hands would flow, the power would flow from them to another source that would be able to give a bit different perspective on the history. And so the fight was over who was going to control the economics of that. And what they did was they tried to smear the honor of a lot of these guys that had been considered great scholars before that, for the purpose of trying to keep themselves in power. And that's what all that was about. So, you know, there's been a long history of the Jews being a part of trying to hinder the progress of black people in this country for a variety of things. And they have joined a lot of the movements that helped to hinder that. It's only of late that some of them have been trying to associate themselves exclusively with the Holocaust and so forth, call themselves victims, and move in that particular direction. But the history of the Jews in this country is a very interesting thing.
But I
know you didn't plan to go that long on that subject. So.
Not necessarily. Because my thing is very organic. It's just so much stuff out here. Our people have been so indoctrinated for generations. Like what you were talking about, doing the research for the reparations. And folks say it'll take so long. But it's going to take another 400 years to get over the last 400 years, okay? Further action ain't going to work for 40 or 50 years to solve a 500-year problem. So we're dealing with the history, just telling the correct history. Like you look at who started Hollywood. Yeah, Thomas Edison, he supposedly invented the film project. I say supposedly because he had a lot of black people working for him, inventing things for Thomas Edison that he took credit for. Like somebody once said, what was the greatest invention that white people ever invented? It was the patent office, okay? So like we look at Hollywood. Who started Hollywood? Jews, okay? They started Hollywood. They knew the power of propaganda.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think you have a great point there. I mean, look who were the moguls at that time. Golda Meir. I mean, not Meir. The Metro. I think it's
Metro. I know you're talking about. Yeah. Goldwyn or Gold. I mean, like they got names like that. Thalberg, one of the earliest prolific producers in Hollywood. He died when he was like 37 years old, and he left his mark on Hollywood. I mean, he was from Brooklyn, I believe. Thalberg, and you got the Zucker, and Warner. They got Jewish names, Jewish people. They can look up the history, the Warner Brothers, all of them.
Yeah, Warner Brothers and some of the other major studios.
Yeah.
There's a book that I suggest that if your readers want to really take a look at. It's a great book. It's called How the Jews Invented Hollywood.
Exactly.
And it really deals with how they created the images of the bulging big eyes and the buffoonistry that went on, and the yes boss, the big lips, the watermelon teeth hitting black folks that were clowns. And to today, a lot of times, we still inherited the mantle of those horrible images, because a lot of times the films that we are associated with a lot happen to do with a lot of comedy, has to do with a lot of our folks not dealing with serious issues, and dealing with a lot of foolishness.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually carry on a lot of that stuff as a legacy from what these people have started from the beginning. But at any rate, going back to the project itself, we are trying to get a lot of people to understand and so that they could be trained, because there's a lot that goes in with it. And like you said before, even though it's only been about 15, 20 years since we came, about 15 years since we came to South Carolina and started this work. Look at the progress that we've made in terms of doing it. When we finish, I guess we'll never finish in my lifetime, but when we get to a point where we can be self-sufficient, we believe that our people will become virtually masters of our own story, and that's a good thing, because we've always relied on other people to tell our story, and most of the people who even the so-called liberal rights, or those people that want to help us in terms of having our stories told, if you think about this, the majority of them have always been involved in being leadership. In other words, they not only want to fund it, but they want to control it. They want to be able to have the last dibs on the direction of what our stories is. And you can always tell when the shift changes, because anytime our folks, and you'll see this throughout history, demand to be the ones that control the narratives, these people begin to pull out. And a lot of times what happens is that they seek to try to discredit you, because it's not them telling your story, it's you telling, it's you telling the story. So, and you'll find that in different levels of things, whether it's politics, whether it's literature, whether it's sports, whether it's any of these things where we try to take a hold of our own narrative. Once that happens, the whole paradigm shifts. And so one of the things that we have been trying to do effectively is to just ignore them. Just ignore them, because we know that in the long run, if we produce our own works, we're going to publish our own works. We're going to start building the presses to even do our own publication. We're going to start helping to build things that are going to surround this whole process, that are going to bring an infrastructure in which we're going to be able to control. We start with South Carolina in doing it. And by looking at this, it doesn't matter what the other folks say, because you're controlling your own narrative. You're telling your own story. And you're doing for a change what you need to do to let the world know what it is who you are as a people, and not necessarily get involved in even looking for the other folks as a financial base, because once you become dependent on another source, they control your narrative.
That's very true, and I also want to tell people now that really we could accelerate. It might have took 500 years for them to indoctrinate us to this point, but with the technology that we have existing now, you can actually make a feature film on your camera, on your cell phone. Okay, it was a guy who won an Oscar for doing this, covering this obscure American musician who was very popular in South Africa. And basically, he didn't have all the money in the world. What he did was he took his camera phone, his cell phone, recorded stuff, putting this together, edited and pasted. Took him several years and won an Oscar for it. It was a Detroit musician. I think he was signed to Motown. I forget his name. I believe he's Mexican American or something like that. But the thing about it is, people got to understand this as well. With Hollywood, it's not about facts. It's about money. And it's not about, everything being accurate. It's about getting there first to tell a story. Because if you're the first person to tell a story, it lays the blueprint and the foundation for all the movies and all the books to come thereafter. Because white folks, they agree upon a lie. They don't care about the truth when it comes to white supremacy. It's all about the lie, promoting the lie until it becomes the reality. Because I think about, you talk about blackface. Who started blackface? Who were wearing blackface at the beginning? What is the foundation, the roots of American entertainment? Because people never talk about, when it comes to the powerful media, the African Freedom Journal. They forget to talk about the African Grove Theater in New York City. Ira Aldridge, one of the greatest Shakespearean actors of all time. When he saw they was doing blackface, he left this country. Said, "To hell with this country, I'm going to England." And he's one of the greatest Shakespearean actors of all time, a black man who had enough pride and dignity to say hell no to America and go to England and do what he loved to do in dignity. So we don't know about the Ira Aldridge. You look at Burt Williams, a guy who was a comic genius that everybody stole from W.C. Fields to Buster Keaton to Charlie Chaplin. Everybody borrowed from Burt Williams. And he wore blackface, but Burt Williams was a proud black man. If you went to his house in New York City, he had a large library on the African place in world history. He could talk about the African place in world history. You had black entertainers at the beginning of the 20th century. Although they were wearing blackface and doing certain things to get by, they had a lot of pride in being black and being connected to Africa. Look at some of the early plays and stuff that was going on and some of the songs. So we have all this stuff going on. Even with Duke Ellington, you look at somebody like Duke Ellington or Sun Ra, these guys were historians. They'll capture in the narrative of our people through song. They immortalize our story through song. So we can never underestimate the power of what we have. And we always talk about, well, they so powerful. Well, Henry Ford, his first car company went bankrupt, right? He lost almost $1 million. His first car company. I'm telling you, that's in their money. You got to adjust it for inflation, but he started over again, and he said, well, you know what? They're trying to control my company. I want to own my company. It's something about ownership, though, that we should be getting back to. When you own something, like you said, you control the story and the narrative. So I'm going to get you back on, because I know people want to hear you, but I just want to put that out there for people to think about.
No. This is good. Well, it's before us. Two things, and I'm going to mention Malcolm X in both of them.
Right.
And one, it was one of the things that made him the most dangerous man in the world, in America at the time. Even though he came out of the Nation of Islam theology in terms of do for self, build your own, and that kind of stuff. But he expanded it once he left to a grassroots operation that gave birth to understanding that as a philosophy in America, which helped to bring on the whole Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s. And secondly, in talking about the who taught you to hate yourself, or the blackface and all that, I remember in 1962, I believe it was June of 1962, one of a couple of brothers got shot in the L.A. mosque at Temple, and one of them got killed, Brother Stokes, and Malcolm did a rally at one of the churches in L.A. And I remember one of the things him saying very clearly, which helped to give people a great understanding of this stuff when you're talking about blackface and the images that we have. He says that you ask the Elijah, you say, why are you asking me? Does Elijah Muhammad teach it? He said, what you need to do is ask the people who taught you to hate yourself, who taught you to hate your lips, who taught you to hate your hair and the texture of your skin, who he said, before you start accusing somebody else of teaching hate, you ought to investigate why you hate yourself, and why it's so thoroughly embedded in your head. And so those are the things that we need to get to the bottom of to be able to psychologically eradicate these things. So we, even though slavery's been over 150 years, we have, or at least there's physical slavery.
Right.
We have been suffering from a mental slavery ever since then, and it's something that we have not really begun on a mass level to deal with in terms of the effects of it. And it's just like an alcoholic or a junkie, right? One of the first things that you need to do before you can move on to recovery, which they never do, but at least they move on to a direction of recovery, is that you first have to admit that you have an addiction. You have to stop denying the fact that that you have an alcohol problem or a drug problem. Once you say physically that this is something that you're afflicted with, it's only at that point that you can start going forward and begin to heal and begin to understand how to deal with the psychological effects of what you physically recognize as a problem with yourself. And it's the same thing with black folks. Until we recognize that we still have a slave mentality that has been fueled by a system that has fed us images that make us hate ourselves psychologically, until we recognize that, we're not going to be able to get to a point where we can start dealing realistically with other issues of joining with people and dealing with things that are going to move us further in time in a very positive way. Because as long as we have that baggage with us, we're not going to be able to develop into the complete human being that we need to be in order to be able to compete on a level and which other people see us compete on. So I just wanted to.
And also, I want to let people know. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. No, okay.
Now, I want to let people know that you are one of the foremost Malcolm X experts around. Like, you really have studied Malcolm, and you are quite an expert on this man and his legacy. And I want to talk a little bit about that as well. But I want to ask you a question I wanted to ask you earlier. Was Christopher Columbus, was he a Sephardic Jew?
Well, okay, let's. There is a lot of evidence that shows that he was.
Okay.
There was a lot of evidence that shows that who was later on Admiral Columbus or was involved in a lot of stuff, travels in Africa, and he changed his name to reflect that, and that he was literally. There's a lot of evidence that shows that he literally was funded by the Sephardic Jews because he was one. And but the evidence is not totally settled on that. But I think that there's enough body of evidence that shows that when you look at the life of Columbus, that and you understand the history of what's going on, because you can't divorce Columbus's voyages. You can't divorce Columbus's interaction politically. One of the things that we do know is that Columbus was actually seeking to make his voyages a long time before he did, but because they were still at wars with the Moors and Spain, the wars disallowed those particular things from going on. But the Jews were pretty much revving up, knowing that what was coming. They didn't actually see the depth of the Inquisition the way they did, which expedited their move to want to leave Spain and worship in a way that they could on their own. But in that particular instance, you saw that there was a symbiotic relationship between them and Columbus, and I think someone needs to really write a very definitive book, pulling all of those documents together to show that there is one book I think it's entitled Columbus Was a Jew, and they have a lot of documents to support that particular thing. But I think that there's a couple of books that needed to bring the scholarship into a level in which it be conclusive. I know that I've been in the process in the last month in translating Columbus's diary from the one that's in Barcelona. And that's only because of one of the, a lot of people don't know, when Columbus came to America, there were Africans here in America already.
Yeah, we need to talk about that, because if you don't understand that, just say it again, there were already Africans here. He talked about it in his diary, right? They saw Africans everywhere they went in the so-called New World.
That's the reason I'm doing. That's the reason why I'm doing a translation right now, because a friend of mine asked me, where can you find this stuff? And I haven't been able to find an English translation of the diary, so I just started translating it myself. And I did that. I just started that last month because I wanted to answer one of the people's questions on that. Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, right. Has a wonderful book called They Came from Columbus Before Columbus.
That's
and
right.
He cites Columbus's diary. And one of the things that people don't realize is that Africans have been coming to the Americas at least 1,000 years before Columbus. But you see, it's not. It hasn't been an issue in terms of that, because they didn't come here to conquer. There is a relationship between the hieroglyphs on the Mayan temples and the rooms, and connection to the way the pyramids are built in Mexico and some of these other places where they have almost identical systems of being able to bury major kings with the celestial markings that have the lights going down to the chambers, hitting which is almost identical to the way ancient African people have done. Now, one of the things that we know for sure is because, and Ivan Van Sertima, who was a brilliant historian, showed us was that if you know anything about alloys, or alloys like gold and silver and that kind of, they have a DNA, just like we have a DNA. When you trace our DNA, you can bring us back to a particular region because the markers are there from the regions that are there. Well, gold, silver, and those types of things also have a DNA. You can actually specifically hone in a particular thing like gold to not only to a country where it comes from, but a particular region in the country, because every gold doesn't have the same DNA sequence that it does anyplace else. And what Ivan Van Sertima did in his book,